Hello, welcome to my show on interpersonal communication. This is Dr. Marquita Byrd, and my students call me Dr. B, and I'm interested in helping the public and the general community learn more about interpersonal communication. One reason is that interpersonal communication shapes the quality of our lives. When we don't have good interpersonal relationships, even one poor relationship can make our lives not as good as we would like. So I would like to share that knowledge with you and help you to facilitate the skills that you need to live your best life with your interpersonal communication. Today the show is going to be on something that people find of interest, and it's on nonverbal communication. And you'll get a chance to see, whenever you watch my shows, you see a lot of nonverbal communication, but I'm going to help us to understand it better. Now, nonverbal communication is very important because communication researchers suggest that 82% of the meaning of a message is derived from the nonverbal, not the verbal. And nonverbal, let me define it, is everything that you hear or see other than the words. It's everything that you see, everything that you hear, but not the words themselves. So that covers a lot. We have the words, but we have everything else about it. As we go through this lesson, we're going to talk about what nonverbal is. We're going to look at facial expression as a big part of nonverbal communication, eye contact, because you've heard the eyes are the windows of the soul, and oral nonverbal that is you can hear it, but it's not words. So those are some big topics we're going to talk about today. Let's talk about the first one. We're going to define nonverbal communication. As I said at the beginning, it is everything except the words. But what do I mean by everything? Well, that means eye contact, the facial expression, even the clothing that I have on, my haircut, my posture, my movements, even the smell of another person is part of nonverbal communication. Lastly, paralinguistics. Paralinguistics have to do with how we say the message, and that's extremely important. So there are a lot of things that go into nonverbal communication, even the color of your hair. When I'm out in public now, people treat me in a different way because I have white hair. I didn't always have white hair, and they didn't give me the same kind of courtesies. Redheads, people tell them that they're fiery and combative. Blondes are supposed to be more fun. So the color of your hair even can be part of your nonverbal. So we talked about what nonverbal is. That's the first point, and it is everything but the words. And I listed several types of nonverbal communication. Let's go on to facial expression. Wow. When we're talking to people, we're always hopefully looking at their face. I'll just give you a little lesson. When people have babies, you know that the baby can't talk. The baby can only cry, and that's the nonverbal communication the baby has with us. It cries, but also parents, especially mothers, pay very close attention to the baby's face, and then the way the baby moves. Even the way the baby smells may indicate that the baby may be sick. And so we look at all that nonverbal data. For example, when my children are young, I would go to their room every night before I went to sleep. And I would stand in the doorway with their lights off and listen to how each one of them was breathing. I would look at how they were in their bed clothes, the sheets and things like that, if they were really twisted or they looked in place. I would touch them to see if they were too hot, and maybe I need to take some cover off or change their clothes. So they weren't talking to me, but we definitely were communicating through nonverbal. So that's how important nonverbal is, especially for people who cannot talk. Another example, my oldest son lives in a group home, and he has muscular dystrophy. There are only 2 clients in the home who can talk. The other 4 are nonverbal. They're mute. Even though they can't talk, they still do communicate. For example, when I come to the house, one of them will come to the door and he'll just stand there and look at me. That's his greeting. Another one walks up to me and she looks at me, and if she stands there for a while, I notice she's having a good day, and I'll look at her face and I may pat her on the back to say, okay, I'm glad to see you. So even though they can't talk, they do have nonverbal communication. So that's very, very important. So let's talk about facial expression and how difficult it is. That's the second point. Facial expression is difficult to decipher. And let's talk about the face. The face has many moving parts, and I'm going to take my glasses off so you can see. When you're talking about the face, you're talking about the forehead, which is one area, and it has movement. Then you have the eyes, and the eyes include the eyebrows and the eyelids and everything around the eyes. That is another area. Then you have the cheek bone and jaws. Those are areas that move. And then you have the jawbone itself and the mouth. And the mouth is very expressive beyond what you hear. So the face is extremely complex because it has a lot of moving parts. And you may miss, they move so fast that the naked eye cannot catch all of the movement. A lot of the facial movement can only be deciphered or even seen if it's on camera and you slow the camera down, as you can see the face moving. Sometimes people say, I don't know what it is, but I think that person doesn't like me. Well, across that person's face may have passed some dislike in their looks, but you didn't catch it. So the face moves very quickly. So there are many moving parts. The second thing about the face is that the way our facial expression is culturally determined. We learn how we should use our facial features through our culture. Our culture tells us how do we express things. And so that's why people from different cultures may look a little different, because their culture teaches them to use their face in a different way. Lastly, nonverbal is idiosyncratic. Idiosyncratic means that it's specific to an individual. So you have to know people well to be able to understand all of their facial expression. And here's another example. My son, I would take him to public functions, my oldest son, when he was young, when he was maybe 9 or 10, and he was still developing his language skills. So he would stand someplace in a public gathering and he would smile. He would have a smile on his face. And people would say, oh wow, he's so pleasant, he's always smiling. But I knew that he wasn't feeling quite right. So when I saw him standing somewhere smiling, I started saying, how are you feeling? What's going on? And then I realized that meant, the smile meant he was confused and he didn't know what was happening. He didn't know how to respond. And so I knew that then that when I saw him standing in the corner smiling, that I needed to go to him and say, are you okay? Do you need something? So idiosyncratic, those behaviors were very specific to him, and you would have to know him in order to interpret it. So facial expressions are difficult to decipher. They have many moving parts, they have a cultural dimension, and also they are idiosyncratic. Let's go on then to learn more about facial expressions. Although facial expressions are culturally determined, there are several facial expressions, basically emotions, that are recognized. They're universal, no matter what culture. The first one is anger. Anger is one that people are easily, they pick up easily on, and that's not depending on the culture. How do we find this out? Well, people who were studying facial expressions took photos of actors who were trained to show anger, disappointment, etc. and so forth. And they showed these photos around the world, and everybody was able to identify these basic ones. So the first one is anger. The second one is disgust. Anger may look like, frown, that sort of thing. Disgust is like, and that says, oh, I'm disgusted with you. Then there's fear. Fear is one that we recognize in humans and animals. And it may be a look on the face that says, I'm fearful. Then there's surprise. That's the easy one. Surprise. Happiness. We can tell when someone's happy because they smile, their eyes open more, and they may be moving around with their nonverbal that says they're happy. Last, the next one is sadness. My example is that once I went again to my son's house, and one of the clients who can't speak was sitting at the table, and she was looking like this. Now, in general, her face was saggy, but this look said something different. And I looked at her and I spoke to her. I said, "Joni, you look sad." And the staff said, "Joni just came home from her family's home and she's sad because she had to come home." Now, I would have to know Joni. We talk about idiosyncratic. I would have to know Joni's nonverbal to recognize that she was sad. But I was able to say, "Joni, you're sad," and talk to her about, "Oh, you're sad, you left your family and that's tough." And so we look at people and we can determine those sorts of things. So anger, disgust, fear, surprise, happiness, sadness, and the last one is contempt. And I don't know how I can make a difference between disgust and contempt, but it has something to do with the mouth. And when you see it, you recognize it, contempt. It may be a pursing of the lips. So those are the universal facial expressions that people can recognize around the world. Isn't that something? And we even found that the eyebrow flash, did you see my eyebrow flash? That occurs among all primates when they recognize each other. You know how we'll walk in and we may not say anything to the person, but we'll raise our eyebrows. The eyebrow flash is something that's current among primates. Let's go on to talk about eye contact. Oh, poems have been written about eye contact. Sonnets, essays have been written about it, because the eyes, we say, are the windows of the soul. Because people will say, "I need to see your eyes before I can determine if you're lying or not." And you know, our parents always want to look in our eyes when we're kids, when we're talking to them, if they're trying to determine if we are being honest. Eye contact is when human beings look directly in each other's eyes. That's eye contact. Not at the face, not at the nose, directly in the eyes. And it only lasts for a few seconds. Eye contact is extremely intimate, and people don't hold eye contact very often. Just let me talk to you a few minutes about at the club. I know all of you go to the club sometime, or you go to places where you're dancing. And I ask my students, how many times do you have to make eye contact before you know that the person is interested in you and they want you to come over? Well, sometimes they'll say 1, 2, but it's actually 3 times. If you're sitting in public and someone makes eye contact with you 3 times, that usually indicates that they're interested, and maybe you should kind of mosey over. Okay, so you can't shout across the club, right? So how do you bring your nonverbal, how do you do that closer? Well, you start walking toward the bar, or walking toward somewhere near the table. You don't go over and talk right at the table. Women have a great excuse because they can go to the bathroom. Okay, we're going to go to the bathroom, so while we're going to the bathroom, we'll pass by the table, or we'll pass by the guy at the bar. So that we're using all this nonverbal to say, "Hey, I'm interested." And that's a very, very important type of contact. Once I was sitting at a club and I was at a table by myself. It was very crowded. So a gentleman came in the door, and of course I'm not paying attention to the door, but I finally looked over there, and he looked at me and nodded his head to say, "Can I sit there?" He never spoke. He just said, "Can I sit at your table?" And I nodded my head to say, "Yes, you can sit at the table." So he came over and sat, and he had a drink, I had a drink, but we didn't interact. That was the only interaction we had. So, and then when he finished, he left. So that was a total nonverbal reaction. So nonverbal eye contact is very important. Eye contact is the windows to the soul. Let's talk about the eyes themselves. Interesting fact, during medieval times, they would have winter festival, which was a midwinter festival, and the women would want to look beautiful. So in order to look beautiful, we know that softening of the pupils makes people look more attractive. It makes them look more sensual. And so they would put something called belladonna in their eyes, and it would dilate the pupils. Belladonna means beautiful woman. And it's that same stuff that your doctors put in your eyes when you go to see the doctor and he wants to examine them. Now, of course, the stuff that they were using, the belladonna that they were using was, could be lethal if it was not used in the right proportions. But they would put that in before the dance. And of course, they couldn't see, like we can't see when the doctor dilates our eyes, but they were beautiful. So that's an important fact, that people whose pupils are bigger and they seem softer look more attractive. So many photographers, when they're taking pictures of models, particularly of women, and they want them to look sensual, they will airbrush the pupils so that they look softer. That's how important eyes are in our nonverbal communication. So pupils dilate to regulate the eyes, and they dilate to regulate the light. We want to start with point 3, and point 3 is very, very important in terms of nonverbal because we're talking about the eyes. The eyes, people say, are the windows of the soul, and that they can only tell if you're telling the truth if they can look you in the eyes. I've heard people say that, well, I need to look in your eyes to make sure, because we feel that we can interpret what the person is saying with the eyes. Now, when I say eye contact, I mean when the human beings look directly in each other's eyes. It is such an intimate act that we very seldom look very long in someone's eyes. You can tell if people have an intimate relationship because they look in each other's eyes more. When I say intimate, I'm not talking about sexual. My dad was a very young looking man, and when we were out in public, very often people would assume we were married. We had not intimate relationship because we were father and daughter, and I learned my nonverbal from him. But we looked at each other's eyes often, like parents and children do. And so intimacy does not mean sex; it means closeness in relationship. Now, let's talk about the pupils. The pupils are so important in interpersonal communication because the size of the pupil can indicate whether or not you're interested in someone. There was this horrible study done in the military in the World War II. When psychologists first realized that when people see things that they like, their pupils get bigger. And so the Army was actually testing for homosexuality, believe this or not, by running photos in front of the soldier's eyes and seeing how the pupils enlarged or decreased. Isn't that something? So and they were showing them pictures of other men in various sexual acts. And so then they were not allowed to go into the Army because of that. So we can use our research in many ways. So dilation of the pupils and the iris is very important. We know that when photographers do pictures of models, very often they airbrush the pupils because that makes the pupils look softer, and therefore the person may look more sensual or more attractive. And we do have studies where people find the same picture but with airbrushed pupils to be more attractive. We, for example, know that if you see something and you don't like it, then your irises tend to tighten, and that might show that someone doesn't like you if they're looking. You may not know it, but it's going on. Let's look at the eyebrows. The eyes are so exciting because there are several things that are moving with the eyes. I'll take my glasses off again. Dr. Edward T. Hall diagrammed the eyebrows and the eyelids and the flesh around the eyes. He found that the movement of those three things could give us 100 different positions. And so, wow, that's very influential in how our face looks. So our eyes are very, very important. And it's important then that when you're meeting new people, when you're talking to professionals, that you want to give them eye contact. Eye contact can also be used to control a situation. For example, if you're giving a speech and you want to get the audience's attention, you don't start talking. You stand there and you look at them. And once you get their eye contact, then you're ready to start. Let's go on then to nonverbal communication that is heard. That's point number 4. Nonverbal that is heard. That includes volume, pitch, rate, articulation, and pauses. Volume could be very loud, and that gets people's attention, but it also may intimidate them. I'm a loud talker, and if you come to the communication studies department in any university, the people are going to be talking really loud because we're communication professors, and so we have to sometimes remember to lower our volume. Then I could be talking with very soft volume, which sometimes I do with the baby and grandkids, and that says something very different from a very loud volume. Secondly, pitch. You could be talking very high and very precise, very high pitch, and that's a very different sound from a very low pitch, or what sounds like low for your voice. And people have told me before, I know when you're depressed because your volume goes down. Rate of speaking, how fast you speak and how slow you speak. The rate of speaking tells us things about how you're feeling. Articulation. Many of you may have experienced this with your parents. I know I did. When my mother was very, very upset with me, she would say, Marquita Levon Byrd, in a loud voice, very slow, and articulating my name precisely. When she was okay with me, it would be Marquita. So it was the articulation was important. Lastly, pauses. We use pauses to get people's attention, or of course to take a breath. But in my classes, if I want to get the attention of the class, instead of hollering over them or talking very loud, I will pause. I will stop and get their attention. And when we're giving speeches, of course, we want to use pauses very well. In our interpersonal relationships, we use them very naturally to indicate interest, to indicate I want to give you more time to think. So we talked at point 4, a nonverbal communication that is heard. Let me kind of wrap this up. Let me go on to wrap this up and conclude that today we talked about 4 points, and those 4 points include a definition of nonverbal communication. Secondly, facial expression. Third, eye contact. And fourth, nonverbal cues that are heard when people are speaking. And that's called paralinguistics. Paralinguistics means alongside language. So as I conclude then, I've talked about the 4 points we've made, and I want to reiterate that nonverbal is 82% of what we get from a message comes from our nonverbal communication. So the way you stand, the way you sit, the way you move, the clothing that you wear, all tells something about you. It may not be what you mean, but what's important is how the other person interprets it. So nonverbal, pay attention to it as you're communicating with others, and make sure that it is reassuring, that is supportive, especially talking to children, and that is honest. It's authentic. People can tell when you're pretending, so you want to have authentic communication. I will leave you today with this note from Mr. Spock: live long and prosper.